open up a Bible, you can't get away from it. It's the beginning of our story, and so we will begin with that. And so it begins with these words. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, and there was the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the domes of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the whole world." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the day and the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind, which with the water swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the sea, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humans in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves over the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I think Augie's got all the wild creatures that we've mentioned in the passage, in his little ark there. Well, last week I had the opportunity to see the new Little Mermaid movie at the movies theaters, and I was so excited. As a little bisexual kid who loved movie theaters and musicals, it was like a whole occasion, like a sacred day. And actually, I'm usually not a fan of remakes because I'm always just like, if it's good, why are you gonna do it again? So I was a little bit skeptical, but I had to go and be true to my people. So I I thoroughly enjoyed it. Actually, as a big fan of Haley Bailey, I danced and clapped through the whole musical numbers. I thought she looked and sounded incredible. I thought it was so cool how she could bring this fresh new dimension to this timeless story of mermaids and the human world. And the other cool thing about this movie was how beautiful everything was visually. Like from the water to the detail of the sea creatures, it had me wondering how much research was done actually on the ocean in order to make it look realistic. In fact, at some point, my partner Aiden, who was sitting next to me, even said, "What are those things? Do they really move like that? I bet they made that up." And so we're sitting there cackling to ourselves. And part of me is like, of course, it's a fictional movie based on a fun story, so it wouldn't really be all that surprising if there were some things that they made up. But the silly moment had me thinking about something else too. Like, my first thought was, how would we even know if these things existed? We've only discovered 10% of the ocean, if that. We don't even know what is down there. Most of it still remains uncovered, so we could really never know for sure if things were made up or if they really exist somewhere down there. It was also clear to me that the movie was trying to inspire an overall sense of awe and artistry, rather than explaining every little detail with scientific accuracy. The focus was on the story being told and appreciating its characters involved, rather than trying to explain everything that we have yet to discover about the world. Now, if I can say this and still keep my job, I think a similar thing is happening in Genesis 1. Growing up, one of my favorite topics with my dad was actually Genesis 1. And if I could go back and talk to my younger self, I'd be like, please get a life. Think about something else. Think about something more interesting. But at 12 years old, I was fascinated by Genesis 1. I wanted to understand it, what it meant, how it helped me understand the world. And my dad kind of has a weird relationship with the church. He doesn't always really vibe with it, mostly because he's always had a deep love for science and things of that nature. And he grew up in a tradition where he couldn't have both. The preachers around him always kind of told him, this is a literal story, so you can't really love God and love evolution. You can't really think about these things. And so he always kind of had a complicated relationship. So we would have these conversations, and he'd always have interesting things to say about stars, planets, and galaxies. I have fond memories of him showing me things through his telescope when I was a kid and telling me updates from NASA. I never knew any of the words that he would say, but he loved to give those updates. Of course, sometimes I would simply roll my eyes. I was a much bigger fan of books and puzzles and dollhouses, but other times my ears would perk up. And these conversations got a little bit deeper as I grew up, and a little bit more intense when I started reading the Bible. Some of my earliest experiences with the church were also people who read this story literally. They would say things like, if God said it, that settles it. The world was created in 6 literal days, 24-hour days. And some of them would take things even further by saying that dinosaurs couldn't be real, that fossils were propaganda, that the world could only be 6,000 years old because of Genesis 1. And I couldn't fully articulate it at the time, but it never made sense to me that in order for the Bible to have meaning, it had to explain every single thing about how the universe worked and came to be. And so I was so grateful to have my dad as one of my first teachers, someone who instinctively knew that something doesn't have to be historical or scientific to hold sacred meaning for us. And I was thinking about that as I was watching The Little Mermaid and thinking about what was real and what wasn't. Genesis 1 is a passage that is actually very similar to several other origin stories of ancient cultures at the time. So in one sense, it's not really that unique. It has a lot of similar elements as other cultures. And it's clear that the writer was looking at other people's homework in order to construct his own story. And at the same time, it also has its own unique elements. For example, this particular origin story describes a God who is not angry or violent, but one who is powerful, artistic, and full of delight. Many scholars believe that Genesis 1 was written about 500 BCE, when the Israelites had been exiled in Babylon. This was a very tumultuous time for them, in which the Israelites wrestled with how to maintain a sense of home in a foreign land, as well as how to protect their history, customs, religion, and culture. And so because the Babylonians around them worshipped different gods, this contributed to an overall feeling of homelessness, danger, and fear of idolatry. They had lost everything and their sense of identity. And so as a result, it's easy to see why the writers tried to show them through this passage that despite all of the destruction around them at the time, their God was stronger and better than the God of their oppressors. Genesis 1 highlights the power, wisdom, intention, creativity, and uniqueness of Israel's God. That's why the story was written. And so what we find here in the beginning of Genesis is this beautiful work of liturgy and poetry. It's not hard to imagine how these words would have served people living in oral cultures, how its repetitive stanzas, predictable patterns, and formulaic language about God, separating light from darkness and water from land and calling it all very good, would have been easy to pass down across generations. Like we can imagine that maybe it was told to children as they went to bed at night, or sung in worship services, its patterns making it easy to hold in memory. This is a rhythmic and majestic epic that is not primarily concerned with scientific data, but with worship. Its primary focus is to inspire awe and wonder. But like The Little Mermaid, Genesis 1 doesn't necessarily answer all of our questions about history or how things stack up against modern science. As my friend Reverend Alex put it, Genesis doesn't explain why, for example, we can know certain things like how a seed becomes a tree, but there's so much more that we just don't know. Our knowledge of creation is always growing. The same is true for our understanding of gender and sexuality. Genesis 1 verses 26 has often been used as a weapon against those in the queer community who do not conform to traditional expressions of male and female. Folks will get into a pulpit to condemn or yell down a street corner, God created male and female. Anything else is a sin and perversion. And folks do this with both hatred and a lack of information. In many cases, they fundamentally misunderstand what is happening in Genesis. The idea that what is true about the ocean is true about humanity too. What we know about creation is so limited and ever evolving. If the writer's intention in Genesis was to describe every kind of human being that would ever exist, it would never end. Instead, what we see in Genesis is not really a comprehensive description of anything, actually. The book paints with such a broad brush and in dualities in order to illustrate God's power. It doesn't mean that it represents all that would ever exist. It doesn't account for the nuances, exceptions, and mystery that light up our world with beauty and possibility and potential. Let me take you through the passage again so that I can illustrate this point. A Bible commentary from Queer Saints points us to these nuances. On the first day, God separated the light from darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. Does this imply that there is nothing in between? Of course not. There is twilight, there is dusk. Night can be well lit by a full moon, day can be dull and cloudy, but still there is night and day, darkness and night, but neither of this denies the existence of an intermediate state. On the second day, God made a dome that separated the waters under the dome from the waters above and called the dome sky. We know from science that there is not a dome above as a fixed object, but we accept the existence of something we call sky, even though we don't really know where it begins or ends. On the third day, God separated the land from the waters. God called the dry land earth, and the waters he called sea. Again, we know from simple observation that this simplifies the picture. There's not just dry land and seas. On the land, there are also rivers and lakes, as well as marshes, swamps, and deltas that are not clearly either wet or dry, or many vary in state with the seasons. At the coast, there are intertidal zones, which at land are at low tide and at sea at high tide. On the oceans, there are Arctic zones where frozen sea creates ice shelves, a form of dry land. Yet none of this negates the concepts of a difference between dry land and sea, and the concept does not deny the existence of intermediate states. On the fourth day, God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night." And so he created the sun and the moon and the stars. From science, we know this does not complete the picture. What we commonly call stars are actually sometimes nearby planets, showing a reflected light, and galaxies so distant from us that we could not see them with the naked eye. At times, the sky also includes what seems to be shooting stars, meteorites entering the atmosphere, and comets. Here too, the reality of creation shows an abundance of forms beyond those included in the simple description. Same thing when it describes creatures who move. The list is still not complete. By specifying the creatures that move, what provisions are there for the creatures like mussels and creatures of the sea that do not move but cling to the rocks? What of those living creatures we sometimes prefer not to think about, like bacteria and viruses? Are they not also a part of God's creation? Still another simple explanation. And so in the same way, when we get to verse 26, in the same way when the text says God created them, male and female, it does not mean that God did not also create intersex people and transgender people and non-binary people and gender fluid people and agender people and genderqueer people. This verse does not discredit any other gender or expression any more than the verse about day and night rejects the existence of dawn and dusk. In the same way, we know that creation is not only divided into land or sea, there are also marshes and estuaries and coral reefs. As M. from In Flesh put it, these verses cannot mean that there's only land and water and that there's nowhere where the two meet. These binaries aren't meant to speak of all reality. They invite us into thinking about everything in between and beyond. As the commentator points out, the point of Genesis is a literary work, not a scientific catalog. To list every single life form would be frankly impossible. Even today, there are countless species yet not discovered. The writer doesn't attempt to name every part of creation or to exclude that which is not named. Instead, he uses this literary device to form an expression that is meant to invoke the diversity of creation. And what a fine work it is. The authors of this passage used the language that was available to them in their particular context. Not that diversity didn't exist, but it's the language that they had. The writer of Genesis uses careful selection in order to highlight differences that exist on a full spectrum, and it is meant to evoke awe at the diversity. The words are meant to help our minds expand, not to make them small. Read this way, this passage is a celebration of God's good creation, not to keep folks out, but to help us see all the possibilities that there could be, including queer people. There's a line in The Little Mermaid where Ariel says to her father, King Triton, something like, if humans are as varied as the creatures of the sea, why can't we be just like them and go and meet them? In this passage, all are made in the image of God, and all that God makes, even the unnamed and yet to be named, is reason for delight and worship. So much has made us forget that we are all made in the image of God. Genocide, war, abuse, anti-LGBT legislation to this day are all examples of this. But the good news of this passage is that God is never limited by the categories we put life into. This is why the LGBTQ acronym ends with a plus. There's more to be named and discovered. God's very diverse creation, still unfolding and yet to be discovered, is an invitation for joy. So let us rejoice. Amen. And now is your opportunity to share what's bubbling up in you and how this message is moving in you. Yes, Adrian.
So much. I've always been one to say that, we don't know the mind of God. We can't understand the mind of God. That we don't know what a day in God's life would be equivalent to. And I basically have said to a lot of people, I believe that people's genes are a continuum, and that, it's just when we think of men and we think of women, and what's to account for what happened? So I just love the way you kind of put that about what's in between.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that's so beautiful. So thank you so much. I might have to speak again because there was something else that I was thinking. But I wanted to share that, and I know there was something else I was thinking. I know. The other thing is that we know that these were stories that were put together, and I never thought of it before, but we know enough now to realize that the discussion in the beginning about the earth and the sun and the moon and the stars was clearly from a perspective that maybe there were other planets that they recognized, but it makes it sound like our sun is the only sun, and our moon is the only moon, and the stars are there for us, but they're not on the multiples of things that we understand. And people talk about space being inverted. It's so much kind of thing. The edges.
Yes.
So it was clearly those folks were looking. And the other thing I was surprised was when you said it was written around 500 BC. I really thought it was written earlier than that. So, in Earth time, it's pretty young.
Yeah.
I've said a lot, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
Thank you for all of that. Yeah, Theo.
Hi. I just wanted to touch on like two things, which is it's always struck me as odd that that is the section people use to like enforce a hardcore binary and use that to
Mm.
be a section to be like especially transphobic about. Because even if you look at the simpler examples within it of like the land and the ocean, it's like we have droughts and
Mhm.
ocean levels rise and areas that were land become ocean. So why
Mm.
is that the section you're really staking your life on that people can't transition?
Yeah.
Like that it's
Yeah.
like I mean don't be transphobic anyway. But why that one has always kind of like
Yeah.
gotten me a little. And the other thing I wanted to touch on was I just wanted to say I thought it was really neat of you to kind of tie in a story about the Little Mermaid into these discussions of the literalism within areas as well as queer issues, specifically because the original author of the folktale The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen, was himself queer, and it at its root is a very queer story because of that, and it really paints it in like a different light, which is really neat if you dissect it because of that. And I really just appreciated that little tie-in because it's a little full circle moment.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking about that, but
I'm really
that's
into
cool.
folklore.
God doing the thing. I knew that Ursula
Yeah.
was a drag queen originally.
Within the Disney adaptation,
But I
yeah.
did not know that that was because of the creator.
Yeah, he
That's
was.
cool.
You know, the whole history thing of you can't assign modern labels to people who have not used them themselves, but he is heavily speculated to have been gay, and if we use our current modern labels for that, and so that's it kind of paints it in like a little bit of a different light because he wrote a story about Ariel's out there, the Little Mermaid is out there kind of transcending barriers and
Mm.
having a lover she cannot reach without entire societal structures changing of now she has legs, she's learning to perform like being a human through that, and it's like
Yeah, that's beautiful. That full, thank you for, yeah, fleshing out that full circle. Yeah, I hadn't thought about all that, but I'm glad it worked out. Yeah, any other reflections? Yeah, Heather.
Just to elaborate a little bit more on the Little Mermaid, but I mean, again, that transition of I have to tell my family,
Mm.
I have to come out, I have to change. Well, I want to change, not I have to. I want to change to be in this world.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Pretty cool. Yeah, Tarot.
I want to echo Adrian. I loved the whole message. And like once again, you present a scripture I've heard so many times, totally different way. And basing the context of being in exile and a story about, how powerful God is, honoring creativity and everything. And it's about wonder and awe. But the other thing you pointed out was it's too about mystery, and we don't know. And I think that's such a cool. I mean, I personally struggle because I want to know.
Yeah. Right.
What everything is and explain everything. But I think that's part of the process is really appreciating the mystery of what we don't know in between those binaries. And I never thought of it that way. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and there was a lot that you said and that Adrian said that's making me think. But yeah, I thought about the flat Earth as well with this, and just that I know a lot of us look now at that kind of thing and we're like, oh, that's so silly. But really, it's like the history of humanity has taken us to different points of understanding, and I think that is a more faithful way of reading Genesis, is that it's ever evolving, ever expanding, and we are so blessed to live at this time where we can know so much that we didn't know before. So, yeah. Judy.
And that just makes this weird thoughts coming in my mind about science now, where they have all these new ways of pictures on Mars, and how are we going to adapt to the little green men? That
If they want to talk to us.
if they, we don't know. We don't know what else is out there. You know,
Yes.
we're only living in a little tiny part of the whole atmosphere. So
Yeah.
we really don't know. And it all boils down, I think, to selfishness and greed, where we just don't know how to share.
Hmm.
We just don't know how to love people who are different in some way. We want it all.
Mhm.
And that I don't, people say that that's human nature, and it may be human nature, but it's not what God wants for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Anyone on Zoom or here that wants to share? Yeah, Peter.
I was trying to put together my thoughts on the matter. It seems to me that we owe such a debt of gratitude to science
Mm-hmm.
for the rise of science, helped us to think more deeply about things that had been said
Mm-hmm.
and written about in poetic form
Yeah.
and in story form,
Yeah.
and that they were very limited in themselves, but other generations did a great disservice by viewing those things almost scientifically
Yeah.
and as if that was the only truth,
Mm-hmm.
and it was never intended to be that. It was
Right.
intended to be an expression of people's own sense of awe and of wonder
Right.
about the universe.
Right.
And but then we did a disservice by making it something else.
Yeah.
And science came along and said we need to call into question everything that we take for granted
Right.
and everything that we see, because what we see has depths that we do not see,
Right.
and that but are available for exploration and creativity. And I think that you did a wonderful job as your sermon itself became poetic
Mm.
by looking at the poetry of the of Genesis 1,
Mm.
and then there's yet more that we still don't understand.
Yeah.
There will always be more. And the more is wonderful, seen in that plus sign at the end of LGBTQ.
Yeah.
Plus.
Plus. Yes,
Thank you so much.
absolutely. Yeah, plus on the acronym and plus on everything, right? Like it's a model for us that there's always more to learn. And thank you, Peter, for that reflection. And it had me thinking too of how important it is to understand what genre we're reading when we're reading the Bible. When we look at this story as a scientific document, we get into trouble. But when we realize that it's a poem and it reads like a poem, it can do something different, and it can answer different questions. The Israelites, when they were in exile, were not asking themselves about scientific data. They were asking themselves, who are we? Who is our God? And what direction should we be going in? And so when we read it that way, it's a form of poetry for worship and wonder of who God is. Then we end up in a better place than trying to map out where everything fits.
That makes total sense, but there are still those people who, even if you just make that point of how poetic it was and how much of a literary experience it is, and it's not scientific, they're going to be like, they're going to still argue that it's the way it is.
Yeah.
But I think that in that conversation, if you're having a conversation, your points not even going to that depth for them of saying, but let's look at those gray areas.
Mm-hmm.
That is a discussion that is easier in some ways to talk about, right? I mean, the dusk and the dawn. I mean, I'm like, that's just, it's part of the poetry, but it's also part of reality. I mean, nobody's going to argue that there's not a dusk or a dawn. I mean, there's those places to kind of ease into thought, and and when people are so resistant, that you could be talking about those things, and then it's like, oh yeah, now I'm seeing the simplicity in this, but the complexity in it. You know,
Right,
so.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot like that, and maybe that's a helpful thing to use, is that just pointing out the things in creation that don't fall into one or the other, or, you know, exist more on a spectrum. And Theo also brought up, you know, just even living in a time of climate change, these things are actively changing that are blurring the lines, and so that also, well, I don't know, maybe they also don't think that that's real, but but maybe just pointing out examples like the dawn and dusk, things that aren't named but that still exist, and male and female even is, you know, there are so many medical examples of that just not being true. There is not always a clear line that those folks can explain. So yeah. Any others? Yeah, Jaden.
I just wanted to comment on what you said earlier about how people are very rude to each other, and I feel like that's because of lack of understanding, since human nature is based on curiosity, and we most likely fear things that we don't fully understand. So, like, a lot of people at the beginning, like when they discovered different races, religions, sexualities, people, I think people are really rude to each other or just fear one another because they don't fully understand the complexity of it. So if people took the time to understand each other and listen to each other, I feel like there could be more unity with everybody else. So I feel like that's what, it's just lack of understanding and the fear of the unknown is what is
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Theo?
I wanted to jump off of that and then say another thing that commonly leads to that fear as well is self-reflection is scary, and especially like with like queer communities and trans communities, they start that dialogue of aspects of gender are a performance even for cis people, and like sitting down and realizing like I'm a girl, I'm a cis woman, but I don't necessarily have to be dressing this way. It is possible for me to go outside of those bounds and like slowly like deconstruct those areas in your own life. That's scary.
Yeah.
Like realizing like things you've taken as like that's just what you do, and realizing, oh my god, that's a world of possibilities open to me as well, and not just that's scary.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I'm sure we all could find areas of our lives where we don't fit into a box. Things we do as women that, you know, are traditionally not women things, or things we do as men that aren't stereotypically men things. I mean, these lines are always being blurred, and hopefully the thing is that it can open up a world of freedom, that we all can be so unique, and be able to define ourselves for ourselves. So yeah, there's a world within womanhood, there's a world within manhood, and there's so much in between and beyond to explore. So yeah, thank you for lifting that up. All right. Any others that I'm missing? All right. I think there is something in the chat. Oh, that was very sweet. Thank you, Allison. Thank you for being here. Awesome. Yeah, this was a really, really good discussion. I was curious about what your reflections would be, and I just feel inspired by all the things that you pulled out and said. So thank you for allowing me to go there with you today as we begin Pride